Hi, Kevin Blanch. They'll be calling you a radical. Chapter 2, Post-Ignorance. Economic practice as religion. We have had 80 years of American economic modern practices to look back on. Economics and American realities took on levels of never even close strength in regard to societies and individuals' lives in the 1930s. It has not looked back or stepped back ever. I, like my favorite artist Millet, will step back and view economics and our lives via wide perspective. Like Millet, I view the struggle in the entire post-ignorance study. I will begin in the 1930s, when the election of FDR and the incorporation of the so-called Federal Reserve Bank restructure as we know it. Mariner Eccles, my town, my community leader, my mentor, my educator, in the year of FDR, both Masons, as American powers have always before them been Masons. I recently restored the 1905 Ogden Masonic Temple. No one in Ogden even has a clue of its significance, including the past or present so-called historical community. In 1934, on the back of the Great Depression, FDR and Eccles came up with a plan. Many like to call it Keynesian economics. Well, I have factual news for all of you. Mariner Eccles was using demand-side so-called Keynesian economics, not in theory, not even in practice, in the arena. In reality, long before John Maynard Keynes ever became in vogue in his book. What Mariner Eccles is to John Maynard Keynes would be what he was to Babe Ruth, what Lou Gehrig was to Babe Ruth. I love his famous quote, "If FDR was a traitor to his class, what am I?" He was from one of the wealthiest families in the United States, made by his father, David Eccles, a Mormon immigrant from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland. Cadunskins, the Dark Glen. Mariner Eccles parlayed his family's wealth. The U.S. had multiple wives. Mormon David Eccles, Mariner from the second wife, into a banking giant among many other very successful businesses. I have heard Bernanke on multiple occasions say, I'm a student of the Great Depression, and Eccles and FDR's strategies failed. The entire chapter will lay out how ignorant Bernanke's statements are, and how they are rooted in the great Greenspan's fake Ayn Rand philosophy, and how they are downright false and still control wealth mongers of the 30-year ignorance movement. Eccles and FDR's methods did not only work, they created the strongest middle class in the history of the world, 1945 to 1975. And our 5 consecutive conservative presidents, all Republicans in the said context. You heard me right, Republicans. Reagan, H. Bush, Clinton, most Republican of them all in this context. W. Bush, Obama, yes, I said Obama, in the context of the Fed and its policies. He is Republican as it gets. Again, this is not commentary, this is documentary. I will right here, right now, show you that is fact. In the 1930s, Eccles created the World Bank, the Fed structure as we know it today. Absolutely not the use of the past 30 years. He would roll over. His philosophy, which economic practice is religion, is in the core of oneself. Much like religion is from your parents, much like your so-called deluded self-awareness is a person. It is in the ground. It is in ground. His one of the middle class becomes strong and the country will thrive together, all of them. Remember, Hoover and his team, whereas the past 5 consecutive presidents are pure empowerment of the wealth that trickle down on their heads. The masses love golden showers and we love giving them. The only difference in the crash of '29 and the crash of '08 is political timing only. Hoover still had 3 years left and the hate boiled just like now. But Bush was done. The election was right in the heart of the meltdown. So the hate was taken a very twisted and poorly neo-ignorant path. In 1932, the country hated the sick wealth and was ready to embrace the contrarian approach, and did. In this crash, America was ready for the contrarian view, but Obama, as the 30 years of American, was ready for the contrarian view, but Obama, as the 30 years of conservatives before him, jumped aboard and walked right along the supplied side, golden showers rape, as did his 4 predecessors. The empowerment of the wealth, or what they think is wealth, money, that is another big part of this project, weighting wealth. I will break down wealth in its core and show in very clear and factual terms how Americans' wealth has been crushed. As Hoover gave his economic speeches and his economic team, they can be played right next to W. Bush's speech. And if you do not recognize the sound of their voices, you could not tell the difference. It is the difference between philosophies, not in theory, not in practice, in reality. We live in reality, and economic philosophy is our reality. There are only two economic philosophies in the said 80-year span of American life. One, demand side, Eccles Volcker of sort. Two, supply side, Greenspan, the great fake Ayn Rander, as I call him. And in all the two realities, we have had supply side for 30 years in a twisted fashion, like everyone else in America, like killing hundreds of thousands of people who have nothing to do with anything American, whether it is a tax, oil, or anything else. Like all Americans and some Europeans, actions rooted on neo-ignorance. Do not forget the UK went right along with the neo-ignorant annihilation of Iraq. I will lie it out, not in some bullshit economic theory that puts you into sleep, in Freudian terms, which I have been accused of many times being too Freudian. I take that as a compliment. The problem with economists like Greenspan, like Bernanke, they have an agenda in their own sick minds. I am better you, and only a very few of us are capable of telling the rest of what few scraps they can have. I want to be in power above you. I could trickle down on you. They use an exponential route, fooling them with language, because the average intelligent mind, let alone the average ignorant American, has no clue what they are even talking about, and they love it that way. It lets us, all of the sick, addicted to power, small sex lures, embolden and empower their very existence. It is justification. I will go into detail in regard to this Freudian economic post-ignorance view of mine, again, step by step, like Millay, looking back in a wide perspective. I know when people read this book of mine, they are going to say things like, this is an obvious rant and full of poor grammar or crazy thinking. I have written a poem to this response long before this said response. I do a lot of poetry in this book, and these words are all written wrong and the grammar is all wrong if you ever get a copy of this book. See Dick and Jane, see how they run. As I write per se, as I paint per se, as I think per se, as I write per se. I am not as anal as the masses per se. I am pure in mind its status fills with a musical divine path of now and whereas my life. I, as a 30-year-old, as an 8-year-old, as a 50-year-old, listen, read, and think, always think. I never forgot he or him or they, my teachers, my mentors, my friends, my looked up to. I stood and sat and played recesses for all 50 years in the Art Deco mecca of West Weber Elementary and all the other Leslie Hodgson masterpieces. Mrs. Smith, my second-grade teacher, and the said masterpiece of the first one of my many in my life. From his art, his mind, and will reach up with government-backed money, WPA. Mormon artists with craft and skill with their backs and their brains, their work ethic, beehives, remember? She, the wife of the great educator himself, she was brilliant, she knew my brain. Early, she helped me to the library where I never left. I found a book on life in the library. I was 8. Millay, Van Gogh, Michelangelo, a Hawk and Trial, a fresco, a paintbrush, a Friedenecker, last chapter 13, Gomez, Masons, both kind. Or are they the same? I don't think that. I split my own rock. I've held the stones that the Mormons went to push down on the army in my hands. I have stones Hodson's Masons carved out into the walls, in my plaster walls, in my rock walls. I am a purist in every authentic format. I am a very good English grammar and French speller and user. I do not perforate literature. I was using Shift F Control before anyone of my generation could spell it. Go 69 Mets, 2 rookies, Tom and Nolan. Next year Earl did it. I had a resistor radio. I listened to all of it. A grand slam by a pitcher, a shortstop with a life buck time 67. All my gifted teachers in all the great school system we used to have. An art professor at Weber State, right on this very spot where I'm reading this. In 92, I was in 32 in full flight of sex and money as a young man, but the learning was a true love. I was still working. I pinned my work on the critic board that day. You could see her eyes. She stared at for a while. She did not know what to say. Finally, she said, "You're going to be an art major." Jane, "No, economics, finance." After class, she come up to me outside of the union, said, the same union I shook Bobby's hand in 1968 and was engaged by him in pure friendly speech. The same union, his son, 34 years later, to the same inch of space. I've always focused on space, the critic on the wall. Now where I write a writing lab. She said, "Can I talk to you?" "Yes." You know when you use a line or a color or an object or a tiny dot, it all has meaning. She paused. You know that, don't you? Yes. Jane, the smartest of all my brilliant teachers I ever had. I write like I paint like I live like I want, and I smile when I write and or I paint. Look, really look at my paintings. I use tiny Mets Did they beat the O's in '69? Earl was my favorite. I use tiny, tiny, and big, big metas in all my work. There are thousands of my plastering metaphors all over Ogden. My work covered with styrofoam and paint. Some are being taken apart like Christmas presents underneath as my tiny marks, all different. Used my mark chicken foot, some have called it. It is all over Ogden, 24 on Washington Boulevard alone. So when I write, don't correct me, Eddie, he ended up with the Mets, from the O's, from the Dodgers, not Brooklyn or LA, Ogden. Every tiny word or line or the stain on her dress, they have meaning in regard to art. Thousands of thousands in one work, or many, or one, or two. Please don't make me bore you, well, Ann. Please, I hate it. That's all, folks. Wow, in 2010. Who would have thunk it, Clem? Not me. I have been living the country and western version of Hamlet, bar the ending. I am a lover, not a fool. Not a big, anyway, fool. Too big a fool. Kevin Blanch, 2010. First, I will say, of course, this is a rant. When it comes to post-ignorance, I take a completely different view than the mainstream so-called liberal way of quiet talk and civil discourse. And I am in total disagreement with the comedians of our day and the leaders of the so-called Democrats, who are nothing more than Republicans. They're the same. This is how I say it. Cordial conversations are dangerous. Passionate, intelligent arguments get results. Me, Kevin D. Blanch, 1970. My response to poor grammar and my love of using the word fuck is a metaphor to neo-ignorance. I love changing grammar, changing spelling, and using capital letters in the middle of sentence, using run-on and off sentences as metaphors. Again, I am Freudian in the context of language. Get the point across at all costs, by any means you can. I live in the western United States, not in 1842 Europe. The West is rough, very rough still, and the path that I've taken growing up and living in Ogden, Utah is rough as it gets. Take a look at the cover of the book. Do you think I was born with these scars across my face? It took years of living in this violent place. I have lived, wrote, plastered, frescoed, painted, YouTube ran, looking over my shoulder. I view it as in the trenches of life, in the reality which unfortunately politicians and felt policy are so far removed, or should I say never been in. For the most part, some have just forgotten or like being rich while the masses are poor, as politicians are rich in money when we talk of the economic nightmare in this country. In the feel nothing. They feel nothing. They cannot relate, and they do not really care. That is the fundamental difference from the now and the 30s. For some reason, FDR and Eccles were rich, very rich, but cared. I have my theory of why FDR's bout with polio and his loneliness. Eccles' loneliness is in his growing up with his father with more than one wife, and his demand that his children work from a very young age. Remember, his father was a working class man, very hardworking, self-made man from nothing, and I mean nothing. But that is a whole nother book someday. Today we have Bernanke, the academia geek like Greenspan, who has never worked a physical day in their lives. Academia, arrogant fakers. Eccles, very different as a young man, in living in a tent in one of the coldest places in America, working on a power plant when his father died. He knew physical labor. He knew the working man. They were his friends, his neighbors, like both my grandfathers. He knew them both very well. Hardworking businessman, farmer, rancher, Leonard Blanch, sugar beets, amalgamated sugar. Sand and gravel contractor, Abraham Hunsaker IV. The pure white sand pits of northern Utah, the ancient lake shores. Greenspan, as a young college mind, was a huge Ayn Rand believer. That is a fact. He has claimed to be the great free market economist. What a lie. He was no free market economist, and surely not an Ayn Rander, falsely manipulating interest rates to the downside, not allowing the markets to set rates freely via our huge, magnificent bond market. His and Bernanke's actions are so far from Ayn Rand as W being a humanitarian. Greenspan and Bernanke have said many times that the policies of 1930s, Eccles and FDR failed. Wow. You want to talk about failed policies. Greenspan and Bernanke will be viewed in history as the greatest fake failed policymakers in the country's history. All Eccles and FDR's policies did was create the greatest middle class in the history of the world. Not to mention great industrials in design like GM, GE, who by the way bought Watson, Eccles, and others Utah Construction. What have Greenspan and Bernanke's policies created? I'll tell you what they have created. Poverty, debt, 1% society that allows CEOs to make 600 times the average working class American, when in 1975 the number was barely 20 times. The average athlete in this country makes 300 to 600 times the average working class American, when in 1975 that average was not even 3 times. I want to make this clear when I use numbers and or statistics. I am incorporating the 20 million illegal labor force that is 90% paid under the government numbers radar. Over the past 10 years, the United States inflation data from 2000 to 2000 says that this inflation rate rose at a rate around 3% annual. Think about that. Let's talk reality. I have worked on this study for this book for better than part of a decade, and in a broader context for 50 years, but strictly in economic numbers, I have quantifiably worked on these numbers for 2 years. See my study on weighted wealth in the world stock markets against oil, gold, real estate, and currencies in this book. Government CPI, PPI, inflation rates less than 3% annualized 2000-2010. The real numbers, inflation over 20% annualized, the highest in U.S. history. Medium housing pricing up 165%. Gold up over 500%. Oil up over 600%. Wages flat with estimated the incorporated from illegal labor down 35%. U.S. equity prices down 35%. Weighted against oil down 85%. Weighted against gold down over 85%. Our government over the past 15 years changed drastically in regard to trusting government data. Again, Greenspan idealism. I know what's best for the country, and I am a fake Ayn Rander. He and his Fed's policy started mousing numbers up until around 1994. This would be unheard of, and a reason for people to go to jail. The Fed mouses numbers big time. The government steps in regard to buying bonds, treasuries big time. That is a reality. And anyone who says that is not true is a loser, denial big time. My favorite use of the word big time, you will see it a lot. Or just is plain lying. It is all about philosophy. I will prove it to you right here. I wrote this on October 30th, 2010. Just a few days later, one day after the midterms, November 3rd, the said fake Ayn Randers were at it again. The using of what I've termed abstract neo-ignorant Keynesian economics. They purchased $900 million worth of government treasuries. Wow. That is free market economics? Ayn Rand and Mariner Eccles, who was as far as two people could be apart in idealism, would both roll over. It is sick policy. It is Japan on Balco. Yes, I know, I use the metaphor a lot, but it fits. You will see it a lot. CNBC and the contemporized American Wall Street so-called powers say the markets do better under Republican presidents. Right? That's what we hear. Remember, Rick, I need to get my teeth fixed, rant about Obama. Remember that? It was 29 days after his inauguration. In the reality, changed nothing from the status quo. In regard to the Fed, CNBC's continual rants by I have run out of cocaine Kool-Aid freaks. You do know who I'm talking about. He is a recovering drug and alcoholic in the great spirit of W. And the Fox Wacko. You all know who I mean. It is like the old Cheech and Chong movie, Up in Smoke, when Cheech says, I used to be all messed up on the dope, now I'm all messed up on the Lord. That is the voice of Wall Street and our far-right media. In fact, the markets do much better under so-called Democrat president. U.S. equity markets under W. Bush, 8 years down 35%. Weighted, I have broke this down in later chapters, down over 80%. U.S. equity markets under Clinton, up over 8 years, up over 1,000%. And yes, as I write this on 11/1/10, one day before the midterm, that will change nothing. The U.S. equity markets under Obama are up over 40%. So you say, why would be so dug in regard to the conservative idealism in regard to the stock market, totally against reality? I will tell you why. It has nothing to do with performance. It is about the golden shower theory they have. They are sick with control, and they had the ability to rob no accountability for 30 years. Their sick brains know that it is the middle class can ever rise from the impoverished drool this could end. They know under a so-called Republican hairsprayed, fat, lazy ass exploiter mentally, the status quo will remain. They could care less about investors or themselves making money. It has been said that politicians show business for ugly people, which it is so true. And then there is what I say, Wall Street media, CNBC, is sex for ugly people. You would think with all the money, teeth like kernels, that ranty moron could get some dental work. Can you imagine their poor wives? I would bet neither have ever had an orgasm. And if they have, it was not from either one of those two. And there is, I'm in love with any 80-year-old with money, scary, not on 2/5 of Jack. And the host, Twinkie Eater, and confused that I am sex. By the way, he's passed away since Mark Haynes died since then. And she went on CNN. And you know what she did is her seriously. I am sure neither has ever had real sex. Then there is the Tea Party girl, neo ignorant, wow, Stop spending lower taxes. Where do you want to cut those? Entitlement programs. Which ones? What about the $30 trillion war? What are you talking about? What war? Lower taxes, kill, kill, kill. My point is this, that it's about control philosophy. It's not about wealth, as Steinbeck said. The very rich in this country are a poor bunch of bastards. I like to say, I know a lot of very rich people who live very poor lives. It is baby boomer neo-ignorance. It has been known and written about for centuries. There are hierarchies of addictions and sickness, gambling, drugs, and alcohol, sex, and power. We all know the most dangerous in society is power. They're sick with it. Higher than the highest heroin high. Greenspan and Bernanke's economic idealism is ground in like a bad jailhouse fall of 1980 tattoo. That is their sick agenda. And let's talk about their great mentor, Ayn Rand. How did this country put her literature into economic reality? It is crazy, but is what is motivated behind Greenspan philosophy for real. She was born in Lenin. You do know his real name was Yugoslavia. He changed it, Russia. You think she had a counter art movement of her own going on? Yes, her writings are a counter movement, plain and simple. Greenspan used the idealistic reading of literature as Lenin read a book by Marx, both manipulated and justified via the book. Greenspan's tools were as far from Ayn Rand's literature philosophy as I said as W as a humanitarian. It is crazy that I hear, even today, economists use her writings as economic platform. She was a science fiction writer. Okay, go off on that one too. I can hear it before it starts. She called Ayn Rand a science fiction writer. Well, very old news. That is exactly what she is. She is the modern day supply side economist as Hubbard is to the Scientologist, which is totally nuts to me. And I grew up in fundamentalist Mormon Utah. I do get called lost boy in New York City. So that is saying something. This country and of the world have lost their deductive thinking minds in regard to economic philosophy, as in every other thinking, or should I say lack of thinking realm and reality. After WW2, Eccles went to work with Truman's great deductive thinking mind. They joined forces. The debt had gone crazy via the war. And we committed everything to that war, and I mean everything. I think sometimes Americans forget it was truly all in. Eccles come up with a plan to go on to the wealth of this country, which he was one of the wealthiest, and sell them a day of raising the tax rate to 90% on top of the few percent. He pulled it off. They did it. The wealth stepped up. Many resisted big time, but popular opinion was on his side. Let's not forget the media's role and the contemporized Americans' view of the rich at the time. Newspapers, remember when Americans read something with true facts? Go dumb girls and boys. Bonnie and Clyde and Dillinger were household celebrities. Well over 80% of America were on their side, not the banks. The banks had robbed the average American just like today, and they were hated. They hated the big banks. So when Eccles went to the wealth, they had no choice except and make a plan that would work, and work fast, or let American public via Congress do it for you. Another chapter in this book, Congress is the voice of you and I, whether you believe it or not. It is true. They are neo-ignorant just like the American public. So the tax rate went to 90% plus, and it worked. In a very short time, the war was paid for, fast. Can you imagine Bernanke going to the wealth and saying 90% plus tax rate? Why is this said mentality so dug in regard to taxes and paying for nothing? One, because the 30 years of so-called Republican parties knows one thing. The entire platform, lower tax, lower tax, lower tax, started the beginning of the ignorance movement. You got it, Ronnie Reagan. I hear it all the time, the Tea Party, whose entire agenda supposedly is no debt, on one side of their ignorant mouths. Of course, in reality, they are more ignorant than the entire country. And the other side of their ignorant mouths, we need another Reagan. Wow, Reagan and fiscal responsibility mentioned in the same breath. Remember Reagan's great one-liners? One of his best was after he was out of office. When those Defense Department came to me and said, do you want to buy any of those B-2s? I thought they were talking about vitamins, and said, give me a couple dozen, Ronald Reagan. This fact is this. When Reagan was elected, the birth of supply-side economics coincides by pure reality with the ignorance movement. Lower taxes, bigger war machine. It exists to this day on Balco. I know, here he goes again. The debt of the day Reagan was elected was well under $1 trillion, which is pretty well zero. 8 years later, over $2 trillion. 12 years later, after age, $3 trillion, and rising fast. The 30 years of no debt, the strongest middle class in history, the great era of art and design in the United States via Mariner Eccles. Invention and implementation magnificently was over. The philosophy that Volcker himself was using, which Reagan hated and cost him his job as head of the Fed, is exactly what I believe caused the economic short run of prosperity we had in the late 90s. Remember his raising of the interest rate as Eccles chartered and set the Fed up in their role under the restructure of 1934 to control inflation. He did exactly that. He took our medicine, and it hurt, but it worked. That has worked until we found the Republican great Ayn Rander himself, the fake of all fakes, Alan Greenspan again. Here I go with my Freudian take. I would bet in college Greenspan never got laid once, nor to be naked, just a guess. Greenspan would give speeches, which I attended more than once, and throw out his so-called intelligent language. I used to laugh at his babbling language. Everyone would walk away from his speeches, not understand one word he said, and then write commentaries saying what a genius Greenspan was, read his stories of his wife getting together, talk about a power trip for ugly people. I remember Dr. Cooley and I talking about a speech he gave right here in Utah. Dr. Cooley, a real genius, future trapper. Dr. Cooley, who was a genius with language, saying to me, I do not think one person in the audience could tell you what he was talking about. I said it sounded like to me he was talking about nothing. Dr. Cooley said to me, that is why you are in my program. He said absolutely nothing. One of my fellow finance classmates only quite said, I don't believe it. Clyde just gave you a compliment. I was thinking, are you sure? I have an entire chapter in this book on Dr. Clyde Cooley. He had a mind like Einstein when it came to finance. Brilliant. I remember trading the day Greenspan made his irrational exuberance speech. I was a very aggressive derivative trader at the time with a huge success story and reputation. I would personally out derivatives on semiconductor equities, limit out in those days. Another chapter. I had a personal relationship with the CBOE, Chicago Board of Options Exchange, where the vast majority of options derivatives were traded. Writer secretary via the phone. I traded so many options in those days, she knew my voice and would say, Mr. Blanch, what strikes and expirations are you requesting today? And 100% of the time they will be written and available for trading the next day or two. I made it just days once enough to build that biggest house in the county with cash. That is the kind of trader I was. Of course, as Muhammad Ali would say, with his incredible magnificent wit, I thought I was number one. God showed me I was not, in his magnificent metaphor to arrogance. I think of that saying of his nearly every day. That is my life as a young derivative trader in the metaphorical beauty that his words spoke. That truly has to be the greatest metaphor ever in regard to arrogance. In April of 2000, right before the sudden tragic death of my father and Dr. Cooley and the capitulation of my career as a derivative trader, March 10, 2000, the Palm 3 Comp spin-out, which I was heavily involved in. By the way, the day the market capitulated, the day of the 3 Comp Palm IPO spin-out, I was working as an arbitrage derivative specialist and had found the arbitrage very, very early, when even my boss, the hedge fund guru, had no sniff of the said arbitrage. The simultaneous purchase and sale of an asset to profit from a difference in the price, a trade that creates profit by exploiting price differences in identical or similar financial interests in different markets. Arbitrage is the result of market inefficiencies. It is a mechanism that helps ensure the prices do not deviate substantially from fair value for long periods. In the context of a merger or spin-out, if the company is trading two different equities like Palm and Cons were in 1990, when in reality they are the same company, and one of the two said equities from the pure spin-out number is trading too high and the other too low, this creates a pure arbitrage and is a guaranteed way to make money, lots of money, if and only one knows how to use the derivatives market to maximize the pure arbitrage, which I did. I made a huge score. I made a certain endowment rich. I made several multi-millionaires from chump change. I write about this extensively in future chapters. In April of 2000, I was invited to attend the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting by the dean of our great business school. A local businessman had donated to our school some Berkshire Hathaway stock after selling his business to Buffett. Bill Childs of R.C. Willey's, a great man in so many ways. So we went to the meeting via Mr. Childs' jet. At the meeting, the late Dr. Matson, sudden lung cancer at 45 years old, non-smoker. And I had several students. We were invited to the Yellow Party. Yellow means ownership of X number of shares or more owned in Berkshire Hathaway's world. So the party is full of very, very rich people. Later, at the said party, which by the way was pretty cool, Mr. Buffett arrived at his team of security. We lined up to meet him. As I walked along the line waiting for him to turn to meet Mr. Buffett, I was thinking what I would say to him to get him to react. I knew he was a baseball nut, like I am. I am a baseball crazy and always have been. So when it was my turn, I said, Mr. Buffett, you know what I say about you having a bad year. His response in an angry tone, what does that mean? 1999, 2001.